because lives depend on the answer. Which side are you on? So, who here is with President Trump? How about the National Security Advisor and warmonger John Bolton, whose lies have led to the loss of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, of Syrians, of Libyans, of Palestinians? How about the U.S. Special Envoy to Venezuela and veteran war criminal Elliot Abrams, friend and benefactor of the death squad deploying oligarchs who have destroyed the lives of thousands of men, women, and children throughout Guatemala, Nicaragua, and El Salvador? We oppose these men, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I think it's safe to say that these people are our enemies. And not because they're born with genes that make them evil, not because they're appointed by Satan, but, and certainly not because we take issue with the way in which they rule over us. They are our enemies because they are at war with us.
Yes.
And much more so with our brothers and sisters in Venezuela. Progressive Venezuelans, workers, campesinos, these people understand this because for many years they have found themselves on the front line of U.S. imperialist aggression. They've endured inhumane economic, financial, and commercial blockades. They've endured the terroristic violence of the Guarimbas, which are organized by the right wing and supported by the CIA. They've defended their country against outright military coups. And for all this, we should take encouragement that they have gained strength each time they have beaten back these attempts to block their progress down the path that is popularly called the Bolivarian Revolution, and which is most often associated with its champion, Hugo Chavez. In fact, from the day Chavez came to power, which was elected in 1998, up until today, every gain made by the working and oppressed masses of Venezuela has been met with attacks from the pro-imperialist right. And we should study this history because each of these attacks, including the one unfolding now as we speak, each has revealed more clearly the character, objectives, and weaknesses of the attackers. So let's take the attempted coup of 2002, backed by the CIA and carried out by a band of bribed officers, basically lackeys of the national bourgeoisie. In the previous year, Chavez had put in motion progressive reforms which expropriated idle lands for peasants, similar to what Ashley was talking about earlier in Guatemala, land reform, agrarian land reform. And they redirected the wealth derived from oil rents to social programs. These rents, of course, had previously been collected and shared among a few rich families in Venezuela. In response, the wealthy land and business owners of Venezuela organized a multi-pronged attack which culminated in a 47-hour-long seizure of the state, complete with the appointment of an oil baron to the office of the presidency. During this interlude, they proceeded to annul every last progressive reform that was made under the leadership of the majority ruling Socialist Party and its leader, Chavez. They dissolved the Congress, the Supreme Court, the National Electoral Commission, and the Constitution, despite it having been ratified by a wide majority of voters in a popular referendum just 2 years prior. And I want to take a moment to just consider what it means, what it would mean for us to vote on our national constitution, as opposed to having it drafted and decided by a clique of white slave-owning men, right?
Right.
As for those ruling from Washington at the time of the coup, with their usual imperial arrogance, they did not hesitate to recognize what they called the transitional civilian government. And this is a matter of record. These coup plotters are still among the heroes of the opposition that now speaks so solemnly about the need for democracy. Needless to say, this experience was instructive for the working and oppressed masses of Venezuelans. More than anything, they remember and They remember in their bones how quickly the tide was turned when in the hundreds of thousands they poured into the streets of Caracas to defend their President Chavez, to defend their constitution, and to defend the Bolivarian process. By the time the army had decisively sided with the masses and Chavez was restored to power, this people's victory had transformed Venezuelans. Many for the first time understood themselves as the real protagonists of the Bolivarian Revolution. And since then, the political participation of poor and working Venezuelans has broadened enormously. These are the people that now swell the ranks of the more than 44,000 communal councils established throughout the country. And these are the people who are making real the letter of the 1999 Constitution, which calls for a participative and protagonistic democracy. So for the masses committed to advancing the revolution, this Bolivarian revolution, imperialism is not abstract, nor is it remote. By now, it's clear that the sectors of society who are in cahoots with U.S. imperialism, they're quite well known to the workers and even familiar sometimes. These people are not just acting at the behest of the CIA, although there's plenty of money slushing around from the National Endowment of Democracy and the USAID and other fronts. Actually, when it comes down to it, this opposition, the people who have the most to gain in winning counter-revolution, are just acting according to their narrow class interests. These landowners and big capitalists, who still, unfortunately, retain considerable control over the economy, they are bent on disempowering anyone who threatens their profits, and in their desperation, they are realizing more and more that these profits can only be guaranteed by the sword of the Yankees. Some of them only want to guard their inherited privileges, which, of course, the Bolivarian Revolution threatens. And so this requires that they marshal whatever means they can to reverse the gains on power that the poor and working people of Venezuela have made. They are the ones, with the aid of the CIA, who have stoked the flames of the fascist guarimbas. These are right-wing terror attacks, staged as protest, of course, many of which have been organized by Guaido's own party, Popular Will. Sounds fairly fascist. At these guarimbas, the minions of the right wing set fire to government health clinics, to bus terminals, to food distribution centers, all this while they cite a humanitarian crisis and cry for the aid of their Yankee benefactors and protectors. But they do not dare to take power now. Despite having declared himself president, the usurper and would-be U.S. puppet Juan Guaido has no command of the state. The only power he does have has basically been handed to him by the imperialist banks in the form of stolen government assets. So what is this Bolivarian revolution which strikes so much fear in the supposed hearts of the capitalists? What grave dangers did the Bolivarian revolution pose to the U.S. when in 2015 Obama declared a national emergency with respect to Venezuela? To understand the revolution, we have to understand those who make it. Consider the actual state of emergency that the working classes of Venezuelans were experiencing in 1989 at the time of El Caracazo. This is one of the most massive and severely repressed uprisings in the history of South America. At the time, more than half of the population lived in poverty. Hunger was rampant. According to the UN, 1 in 5 Venezuelans, that's 4.9 million people, were undernourished, far exceeding the rate of hunger reported even after the imposition of the anti-humanitarian U.S. sanctions in 2015, which is to say, of course, that the only hunger that merits U.S. humanitarian aid is the hunger for counter-revolution. And in the face of widespread, all of this misery, the then President Carlos Andrés Perez decided to impose austerity measures, like privatizations, cuts to social services, cuts to subsidies on basic commodities, so as to remain in good standing with the International Monetary Fund. This should sound familiar, of course, current uprising in Haiti exploded on similar grounds, and we celebrate their making revolution right now. And the same can be said for the yellow vests in France, for the people making revolution in Sudan. For those who are confused about the term austerity, by the way, it basically means that the poor are told to tighten their belts so that the rich can unbuckle theirs. So outraged, the people of the barrios rebelled and ransacked the commercial districts and the wealthy enclaves for what they'd been denied while the families of the oligarchs lived in luxury. And in case you're wondering, this uprising was not celebrated in the big business media or by the liberty-loving exiles in Miami. In fact, opposition leaders today still pay tribute to Perez, the former head of state, and speak longingly of the days of the Fourth Republic, before the election of Chavez. Anywhere from 396 to 3,000 people were killed by Perez's government security forces during the rebellion. And again, an aside, more than 600 families have received reparations from the Chavez and Maduro governments since then. And I just want to think, or pose this question. Where were the reparations for the likely dozens killed and the more than 12,000 arrested after the 1992 uprising in Los Angeles? It's from the smoldering remains of El Caracazo that Chavez emerged. Just 3 years later, he led an attempt to overthrow the repressive government of Perez. And in 1998, by then, as a great hero of the people, Chavez was elected president of the country. So we know the base from which the Chavez and now Maduro draw their support. These are the exploited workers, the formerly dispossessed. They are the people of the barrios, the Afro-Venezuelans, the people of the indigenous nations of Venezuela, and they are women who have a majority membership in the ruling Socialist Party and who are doing, of course, the majority of the work of the communal councils. These are the Chavistas. If you can't do anything else in the way of research, go and compare a picture of the currently in contempt National Assembly with one from the National Constituent Assembly, which was voted in by 8 million voters in 2017. This body of 545 delegates has constitutionally mandated seats for indigenous nations, for workers, for peasants, for people with disabilities, for students, for pensioners, for representatives of the communes and the communal councils. These are the protagonists of the Bolivarian Revolution. And again, to be perfectly clear, the opposition would not hesitate to dissolve this body if only they had the power to do so. So what have these people achieved, despite being under the gun of the Yankees and their fascist shock troops on the ground in Venezuela? First off, it's important to note that as of 2016, the Venezuelan government has allocated 73% of its budget to social programs. Contrast this with the United States, which of course spends 27 times as much on its war budget than on housing. And the more than 44,000 communal councils throughout the country that are deciding for themselves, that is, democratically, how to spend these tax dollars so that they have total discretion. Education is now free from daycare to the university. Venezuela is 5th in the world in the percentage of the population attending university, and illiteracy has been nearly eradicated, while as late as the 1990s, it measured at about 80%. The Gran Misión de la Vivienda, the Great Housing Mission, has built over 2.5 million homes for low-income Venezuelans since 2011. In the United States, this would be equivalent to increasing low-income housing by 37 million units, given the size and population of the average household. According to a 2018 report by the United Nations, which is to say, even as Venezuela was under siege by the United States, the country had a higher ranking for human development than the majority of the member states of the Hostile Lima Group, such as Colombia, Honduras, Guatemala, etc. And to deal with the effects of the economic blockade, Maduro established CLAP. These are local, it's an acronym, for Local Production and Supply Committees. They're made up of neighborhood groups which grow food and who receive food from agricultural producers. And they distribute this food to about 6 million families at very low cost. Currently, the CLAP boxes are being sent to households every 15 days. By the way, I want to mention that through this program, the United States, the Venezuelan government distributes about 50,000 tons of food per month. And contrast this with the U.S. humanitarian aid package that we're hearing so much about in the news, which amounts to 60 tons. Who is it? And so who is it that is leading every major effort to pull the Venezuelan people out of this economic crisis? It's the same who suffer most acutely from these attacks as the workers. They, as volunteers, are the rank and file of these committees. They are the ones who have formed productive workers' armies, which travel the country to repair and retool shuttered factories to meet the population's immediate needs. They, by their membership in the Constituent Assembly, have passed things like the constitutional law of workers' productive councils, which authorizes them to do what many of them have already done, which is to form workers' councils at their companies and under their command to redirect production to meet the needs of the people instead of their bosses' needs for profit. We know the record of the U.S. government in Libya, and we know the record of the U.S. government in Iraq. We know what the capitalist ruling class of the U.S. will do for oil profits, and we know that Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserve on the planet. But it's not just that they lack another source of profit. Anytime, anywhere that working people organize production on the basis of solidarity, it poses a threat to the means of profit-making for the capitalist class as a whole. And that's why the capitalists of Venezuela would be much happier if only they had to pay tribute to the government of ExxonMobil. Those factories that the Venezuelan workers have taken for their own, after all, mean a loss of profit for their former owners. And this is why Trump and Bolton have singled out Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela for attack. The Oil for Doctors program that Venezuela maintains with Cuba demonstrates the power of solidarity. And those at the helm of U.S. imperialism and all their petty clients cannot stand for that. This is why in the wake of Katrina, when the government of Chavez offered New Orleanians mobile hospital units, rescue and first aid experts, 50 tons of food, all of that was turned away. But we must return the solidarity. We must return solidarity to the Venezuelan people. It is the strongest weapon we have to defend ourselves from enemy attacks. Our enemies here do not hide themselves, after all. They make it pretty plain that they would prefer to invest in cages, bunkers, and walls before feeding the 13 million children in the United States who suffer from hunger. The exact same Washington and Wall Street crooks would like to reduce the nation of Venezuela to the status of a colony, and their record shows the depths of depravity that they'll go to achieve this. So what does solidarity look like for us in the belly of the beast? For one, we can defend our Venezuelan brothers and sisters against the nonstop lies and slanders of the capitalist-owned media. That's a pretty good place to start. And we have to call for peace, of course. This means an immediate aid to the economic war being waged on Venezuela, the people of which are entitled first and foremost to the right to determine their own national destiny. We must make it also known that the Venezuelan people will defend that right, and we should support any and all efforts that are required any efforts that they make to keep the imperialists at bay. If you oppose U.S. wars for profit, that is, if you oppose the imperialist aims of the U.S. government, the greatest purveyor of violence known to man, as Martin Luther King put it, then you have a stake in the fight of any nation that resists its rule. Late in Chavez's life, it was the last 2 years after he'd been diagnosed with cancer, he proposed a change to the slogan of the Bolivarian Revolution. And what was once motherland, socialism, or death, according to Chavez, became motherland and socialism. We will live and we will come out victorious. So, victory to the protagonists of the Bolivarian Revolution. Long live Chavez, long live Maduro, and long live the Venezuelan people.
I want to thank Comrade Ashley and Comrade Joseph for that presentation. At this time, we'll take some questions and answers. If anybody has any comments?
I have a question. I was glad that you mentioned about the School of the Americas, and there has been, throughout the history of us supporting Latin dictators in Latin America, there's been at Fort Benning, Georgia, where most of the people from those countries were trained. You're probably familiar with Fort Benning. There's been a massive protest. It started out small with Father Wood Woodrow, who was an Marinal priest, who was scheduled to leave, and also in El Salvador. But